Alejandro felt his heart race as he stood before the crowd of curious neighbors. In the deafening silence, he knew he would never forget the words about to be spoken. The morning had begun like any other, with Alejandro rising before dawn as the wind whispered against the dry earth. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, painting the outlines of his cracked fields with faint orange brushstrokes. He walked to the fence separating his crops from the dirt road and paused, running his hand along the rusted wire. Dust seemed to penetrate every corner, and some days it felt as though all hope had also dissolved into the air. He returned to the house, his eyes never leaving the mistreated furrows. Once that land had yielded corn and wheat in abundance, but recent seasons had been brutal. With drought and mounting debts, the pressure was unbearable. The thought of losing everything tormented him more each day. Wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve, Alejandro entered the humble kitchen where a mended tablecloth covered a table worn by years. He had barely served his coffee when he heard firm footsteps at the door. The bank collector, a severe-faced man who didn't bother with greetings. He dropped a yellowish envelope on the table and spoke harshly. "Time's running out, Alejandro. Pay up or surrender the property." Alejandro pressed his lips together, feeling a lump in his throat. The collector tilted his head, examining the peeling kitchen walls. "I've been patient, but my bosses won't wait any longer," he added with a shrug. "Do something before it's too late." The collector left without looking back, leaving Alejandro holding the envelope like a dead weight. Inside were the official notifications, the same threats as always, but with increasingly closer due dates. Frustration drove him to rush outside to the yard where Lucero's stable stood. His favorite horse shook his head upon seeing him and softly pawed the ground. Alejandro stroked Lucero's back, remembering the day the frightened sick foal had arrived. He had nursed it to health, transforming it into a strong, noble animal. Now, in a desperate search for money, he contemplated selling it. The mere thought pained his chest. While weighing this decision, he heard someone calling from the main fence. It was Jose, a neighbor arriving on his donkey, urgently waving his hand. "Alejandro, I just saw the bank employee pass by. Looks like they're coming full force, friend." Jose dismounted and approached, lowering his voice with concern. "They say they want the property as soon as possible. Is there anything I can do for you?" "I don't know," Alejandro replied with a sigh. "I'm considering any way to save my land." After bidding farewell to his neighbor, who departed with a sad look, Alejandro took Lucero's reins and walked to an adjacent plot where he attempted to dig a trench to find water. However, after several attempts, he only found dry sand. He wiped his dust-covered hands and contemplated the hole. It was useless. The sun was high when he decided to return. In the stillness, an unexpected sound, like a strident motor, broke the monotony. Anxious, Alejandro looked up toward the dirt road. A motorcycle gleamed in the distance, raising a dust cloud as it approached. The rider seemed to have trouble controlling the vehicle among the loose stones, and suddenly the bike skidded. The rider was thrown, rolling across the gravel before coming to rest beside a bush. Without a second thought, Alejandro dropped his tools and ran at full speed. Upon arrival, he saw a fair-skinned woman with black hair who was getting up with her helmet still on. Her breathing was agitated, but at least she was conscious. With a groan, she removed her helmet, revealing dark eyes filled with confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, crouching beside her. "Nothing serious," she answered, trying to sound firm, though her voice trembled slightly. The motorcycle skidded on gravel. Alejandro offered his hand and helped her to her feet. She checked her phone with an annoyed expression. "No signal. This can't be happening to me." She glanced at her overturned motorcycle a few meters away, its handlebar twisted and parts broken. Alejandro quickly assessed the situation and suggested she go to his house where he could check her injuries and find help. "There isn't another dwelling for several kilometers," he commented. "Better take shelter at my place while we figure out how to fix your bike or call someone." She hesitated for a moment, showing a distrustful expression, but understood she didn't have many options. She nodded, pressing her lips together. So they walked toward the humble house, with Alejandro carrying the helmet and the motorcycle left behind, out of service. Upon entering, the woman observed the simplicity of the place: whitewashed walls, worn furniture, and warm air flowing through the room. He offered her a seat in the small living room, where an old fan squeaked, trying to combat the heat. "My name is Alejandro," he finally said, extending his hand. "Marisol," she responded with a brief but firm handshake. There was tension in the air. She didn't seem like someone who trusted easily. She sat down, rubbed a scrape on her elbow, and after a brief pause, looked at Alejandro almost defiantly. "How's the signal around here?" "Terrible. Sometimes you have to walk uphill to get a bit of coverage, but with the damaged motorcycle there's no option to go farther now." Silence fell, and he took the opportunity to bring a first aid kit. He carefully cleaned the scrape on her arm, noticing her expensive watch and the neatness of her clothes despite the fall. It was evident she came from a different world than his, but he made no comment. When he finished treating her, she thanked him in a low voice, seemingly unaccustomed to asking for help. When mealtime came, Alejandro managed to prepare something simple: rice and beans with a bit of sauce he kept in jars. Marisol sat at the table with some reluctance, giving the impression she'd rather not share details of her life. Still, necessity forced her to remain there. In every glance between them, there was a strange pulse: Alejandro's poverty and need on one side, and the inexplicable reserve Marisol maintained on the other. "Thanks for taking me in," she finally said, breaking the tension. "I don't know how long I'll have to stay. It depends on whether I get a signal, or someone comes for me. Don't worry. Meanwhile, there's a cot available in my sister's room. She doesn't live here anymore. Rest and recover from the impact." After the meal, Alejandro wanted to inquire more, but seeing Marisol's distant posture, he changed the subject. He simply showed her the house so she wouldn't get lost looking for the bathroom. When he took her to the small room where she would stay, she left her leather bag on the bed, and while opening it to check her phone again, she revealed some papers with official seals. Alejandro barely glimpsed what appeared to be a foreign letterhead, but chose not to ask. The afternoon passed without many words. Alejandro took the opportunity to repair a fence in the yard, occasionally feeling Marisol's curious gaze from the doorway. He also had to attend to Lucero, who, nervous about the day's events, pawed the ground with his hooves. As night fell, a cool breeze provided slight relief inside the house. The light from a yellowish bulb illuminated the table where they shared a simple dinner, merely tortillas and some reheated beans. Marisol spoke little, though Alejandro noticed her analytical gaze, as if studying every corner. Perhaps she was looking for traces of something, or weighing whether it was safe to stay there. After washing the dishes, Alejandro saw her head to the bedroom with a tired step. He sighed, feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. Besides the debt complications, now he had a stranger in his house, someone who seemed to carry her own mystery. He looked out the living room window, taking one last look at the fields stretching beneath the pale moonlight. He sighed with resignation, thinking of the unpaid debts. Was everything lost? The question haunted him along with the bitter memory of the threats. Tomorrow he would have to keep looking for solutions, though faith in the future slipped through his fingers. Before retiring to rest, he turned off the old fan and locked the door. Everything was silent, interrupted only by the distant howl of a coyote. It was then that a faint glow caught his attention. In the distance, crossing the darkness of the dusty road, headlights illuminated the horizon and slowly advanced toward the property. He tensed immediately, wondering who could be coming at this hour with so few people in the region. His heart raced. He didn't need more problems. But there they were. One more at late hours of the night. Alejandro remained motionless by the window, observing those headlights approaching along the desolate path. Though tired and hunger gnawed at him, his body remained tense as he watched the lights illuminate the dust from the road, creating an unsettling glow. When the vehicles stopped in front of the entrance, they turned on powerful flashlights that swept across the yard dust and illuminated the gate with an eerie halo. Marisol, who had barely fallen asleep in the guest room, came out silently to the hallway upon hearing firm, rough voices. "Who's there?" Alejandro shouted, cautiously opening the door. On the other side, 4 men with frowning faces and the demeanor of those unwilling to negotiate. One was the same collector who had been there that morning, now accompanied by reinforcements. The gleam of the flashlights revealed the dust in the air, creating a heavy atmosphere. "We warned you, Alejandro," said the collector, raising his voice enough to be heard inside the house. "We can't keep waiting. The debt must be covered immediately." "I still don't have the money," Alejandro replied, containing his anger. "No?" one of the companions said with a mocking tone. "You'd better start packing your things. This doesn't look good for you." At that moment, Marisol appeared behind Alejandro with a serene though alert expression. She wore a light jacket over her sleeping clothes. Her gaze moved from one to another, measuring the situation. One of the men looked at her with curiosity and a spark of arrogance. "Who is she?" the collector asked, squinting. "She's my guest," Alejandro replied, slightly turning his body to block her path. "That's all." Marisol stepped forward without showing fear. In a confident voice, she asked the men to leave, assuring them it was neither the time nor place to discuss. Her calmness seemed to irritate them, yet there was something in her attitude that made them hesitate. For a second, an uncomfortable silence was generated. The collector let out a tense little laugh and looked at Alejandro. "I'm giving you a very short deadline. No more excuses, understand?" He uttered the last words with a gesture of contempt. "We'll be back soon." One of the companions insisted on taking a look around the surroundings, seemingly searching for something valuable to seize. Alejandro planted himself in the middle of the corridor leading to the stable. "There's nothing to inspect. Better leave for now." The collector pointed with a smirk of superiority. After one last look at Marisol, they turned and left, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. When the headlights disappeared in the distance, Alejandro entered the kitchen with an accelerated pulse. Marisol followed him, trying to maintain her composure. There, in the night's silence, they felt the echo of tension. "They're like vultures circling," he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "I don't know how much longer I can hold them off." Marisol observed him carefully. He suddenly seemed to realize he was revealing more details than he intended in front of a stranger. He stood up straight, adopting a more serious tone. "Excuse me. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You don't have to bear my problems." "It's not your fault I saw what happened," she responded, sitting at the table. "I can see things aren't well at all." She suddenly fell silent, as if about to say something important, and then regretting it. Alejandro noticed this gesture and thought that for a simple traveler, Marisol had a surprising poise. However, her silence reminded him that there were certain mysteries about her he couldn't quite decipher. "I'd better try to get some rest," she murmured, rising with a furrowed brow. "You should do the same." With a slight nod, he turned off the main lamp and followed her to the hallway. They bid each other good night without further words. For his part, Alejandro couldn't fall asleep immediately. He lay in bed listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the window. He thought about his debts, about Lucero, about the woman who had appeared just when everything was about to collapse. He was at least grateful for not having ended up in a more serious fight with those men. The next day, the first rays of sunlight came through the curtainless window. Alejandro dressed quickly and went out to the yard, determined to reorganize his pending tasks. He found one of the ranch hands waiting, hat in hand, with a somber expression. "Boss, I need my pay. I have my family waiting for food," explained the man, directing an embarrassed yet firm look. Alejandro sighed and checked his wallet, knowing there was little to offer. He felt ashamed. He couldn't keep postponing his obligations. "Give me a bit more time. I know you've been patient, but—" Before he could finish, the front door opened and Marisol appeared, still with traces of fatigue on her face, but with the same serene attitude. She listened to the conversation, approached, and took a bill from her own pocket, offering it to the worker. "Take this as an advance, please," she said quietly. The worker turned to look at Alejandro, confused. However, he needed the money so badly that he accepted it, muttering a rushed thank you. With a slight nod, he left. Alejandro stood paralyzed, staring at Marisol with a furrowed brow. "You didn't have to do that," he said, almost offended. "This is my responsibility." "I know," she replied, looking him in the eye. "But I couldn't stand by with my arms crossed." He lowered his gaze, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. On one hand, his pride was hurt. On the other, he was relieved his worker could take something home. Tension floated in the air as Marisol silently went to the back of the house. Alejandro preferred to distract himself by checking the situation in the warehouse where he kept a little grain about to spoil due to lack of resources to transport it to the city. Then he walked to the corral to verify Lucero was all right. The horse appeared nervous, disturbed by the previous night's agitation. Alejandro stroked him, reminding him he was safe. Meanwhile, Marisol went out to the small side yard, phone in hand, desperately seeking a signal bar. However, she only received the same message: no service. She sighed in frustration, seemingly needing to communicate urgently, but the place was so remote that even this was denied her. She put the device away with a gesture of impatience. After lunch, a small break was generated. Alejandro sat on a small wooden bench contemplating the dry fields. Marisol joined him shortly, sitting at some distance. Neither spoke immediately, as if both were trying to understand the other's situation without knowing where to begin. "Seems you weren't planning to stay here, right?" he said, trying to break the ice. "Not exactly," she answered. "But things happened, and I had to travel. I decided to leave where I was, although I didn't think I would end up in an accident, much less here with all this chaos. Here we are few and live with what we have. The land is dry, but I can't give up my crops. They're part of my life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say I'm on the verge of losing everything." There was silence. Marisol opened her mouth to say something, but again restrained herself. Her expression betrayed a certain urgency, as if she wanted to release a promise or confession. Finally, she looked toward the clear, rainless sky with the scorching sun that punished without respite. "Maybe I know someone who could," she began hesitantly. "Well, we'll see." Alejandro looked at her curiously, puzzled by these hints that she had contacts or resources. He didn't want to keep pressing her and opted to stand up. "I'm going to check the fence on the south side. I need to make sure there are no—" The afternoon extended in a suffocating heat. Marisol, to help clear her mind, took a bucket and gave water to the corral animals in silence. They reminded her of life's fragility in those lands without sufficient water. She felt moved but, above all, irritated with herself for not being able to reveal all she knew or had. With the sun almost setting, a soft whisper cooled the atmosphere a bit. Alejandro returned exhausted and realized Marisol had been collaborating more than expected. With a brief gesture, they both acknowledged the mutual effort, though an invisible barrier of secrets and pride still floated in the air. At nightfall, when darkness had just begun to envelop the field, a motor noise resonated on the dusty road. This time it wasn't midnight threats, but a larger, more robust vehicle that stopped in front of the house. A man got down from the cabin carrying a package with official seals. On the side of the truck, something indicated urgent deliveries. Alejandro went out and accepted the envelope, fearing the worst. He opened the flap with trembling hands and confirmed his suspicions. Papers full of figures and stamps, legal warnings, and deadline dates he couldn't ignore. He saw himself reflected in the page as the main debtor, and the word foreclosure appeared several times in English, making everything more confusing and threatening. His expression hardened, and Marisol, observing from the door, noticed the contained rage in his eyes. The truckman said goodbye with a sharp gesture and started the engine, driving away as dust enveloped the yard. Alejandro felt short of breath and pressed the package against his chest, closing his eyes in helplessness. The envelope with the new legal threats lay on the kitchen table, while Alejandro, with a hardened expression, tried to assimilate the imminence of the eviction. Marisol, seated across from him, contemplated in silence the pages full of official stamps announcing the deadline to pay the debt or lose the land. From outside came the murmur of a dusty wind that seemed to resonate with the tension permeating the house. The drought showed no mercy. The midday heat made the metal roof overheat, and occasionally a burning breeze filtered through the half-open windows, increasing the sensation of suffocation. Alejandro, with his head in his hands, mentally reviewed all possible avenues to resolve the financial disaster. He had tried to hide his desperation, but the circumstances were stronger than his pride. "We have to pay in a few days," he finally said, raising his eyes. "I don't know how. I have no crop to sell and no one will lend me more money." Marisol didn't respond immediately. Her gaze shifted toward the door where one of the farm workers appeared with an almost pleading expression. The man rubbed his hands uncomfortably, as if fearing to interrupt. Noticing his presence, Alejandro gestured for him to speak. "Boss, the well water is dropping a lot. It's not even enough for the animals," he commented with concern. "What should we do?" With a lump in his throat, Alejandro nodded slowly and stood up. "I'll see what can be done. Meanwhile, take the empty barrels to the old truck. I'll try to go get some water from the town, even if it's just for emergencies." The man left, and Alejandro let out a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his chest. Marisol observed him with a hint of understanding. Though few words had been exchanged, she grasped the magnitude of the problem. She was tempted to offer a definitive solution. It would take a simple act on her part, but once again something held her back. Perhaps she feared hurting Alejandro's dignity, or maybe she wasn't ready to reveal more details of her life. "Lucero," he murmured, changing the subject with a tinge of pain. "I've thought about selling him, but I don't know to whom or at what price. It would be like parting with a piece of my history, and even then, it might not be enough." She fixed her gaze on Alejandro's dusty boots, not daring to say anything in that regard. She knew what Lucero meant to him. Over the past few days, she had noticed the bond that united them. Selling him would not only break an emotional connection, but also wouldn't guarantee solving the main problem. After that brief conversation, they headed to the corral to see if there was any water they could ration. There, some horses sought refuge under the scarce shade. Lucero, restless, neighed as if sensing the tension invading the environment. Alejandro approached and stroked his back gently, as if asking for forgiveness for even considering the sale. "Thank you for these days, for the food and the stay," Marisol suddenly said. "I know you haven't had a single moment of calm." Alejandro swallowed and nodded. "I had to do it. I wasn't going to leave you adrift after your accident. Even if things are difficult, I still have a bit of hospitality left." During the afternoon, they dedicated themselves to checking the main well. So much cracked earth around it confirmed the lack of rain. The mud had become an almost firm layer, and the water level visibly descended. The heat burned their skin as they extracted small bucketfuls to give to the animals. It was insufficient, but there was no other option. At that moment, sunset arrived with a reddish tint in the sky, promising another hot night. Alejandro suggested a plan. Go to town the next day to see if his friend Rodrigo, an old acquaintance, could lend him at least some money or introduce him to someone who would finance a quick loan. Marisol offered to accompany him. He accepted without much enthusiasm, more out of habit than genuine hope. At dawn, they departed in Alejandro's old truck. The road was full of potholes and raised clouds of dust that stuck to their clothes. Halfway through the journey, the truck threatened to stall, which increased the anxiety of both. Marisol, looking out the window, began to understand more closely the harshness of that environment. Small, scattered houses with barely any vegetation, and half-broken signs indicated the precarious situation of many locals. They arrived in town a couple of hours later, when the sun was already beating down hard on the main square. Despite its modest appearance, there was an improvised market where fruits, vegetables, and second-hand items were sold. Rodrigo had a small shop at the back where he offered spare parts and basic mechanical services. Upon seeing Alejandro, he came out to greet him with a worried hug. "Friend, you look thinner than the last time," he said with nervous humor. "How's everything going?" Alejandro looked at Marisol and then responded, trying to appear whole. "Bad, Rodrigo. The debts. I'm a few days away from them taking the farm." Rodrigo clicked his tongue and invited him in behind the counter, where they had a small desk with a fan that stirred the hot air. "If I could help you, I wouldn't hesitate," he confessed sadly. "But I'm in the red. I barely earn anything from the shop. People in town don't have the means to pay, and this year has been worse. I sold almost all my old inventory. I don't have resources to lend you." Alejandro's disappointment was enormous. He nodded, giving him a light squeeze on the shoulder, understanding the situation. Meanwhile, Marisol approached some market stalls, curious and thoughtful. She observed how other people exchanged products without using money, in a primitive but honest barter. She felt moved by the humility and, at the same time, powerless, knowing she could intervene significantly, but without wanting to cause a clash with Alejandro's dignity. When they met again, Alejandro had a lost look. His last attempt to get a loan had also failed. They stayed in town for a couple more hours, having a soda at the only restaurant by the road, immersed in a silence laden with worry. Suddenly, Marisol perceived Alejandro's gaze, almost a silent plea that said, "There's no way out." But he didn't dare articulate the words. They got back in the truck to return to the farm. Halfway, the gas tank almost touched the red line. Alejandro gritted his teeth and crossed his fingers, hoping it would last until they reached his house. The sun mercilessly beat down on the hood of the vehicle, and the heat inside felt like an oven. "I'm sorry to interfere where I shouldn't," Marisol commented, finally breaking the silence. "But if there's something I can do, tell me. I know you don't want me to help you with money, but at least let me do something." Alejandro sighed, his eyes fixed on the road. "I don't know what to tell you. I don't want anyone to give me anything. I've broken my back all my life to get ahead, and accepting a loan from you. I don't know. It makes me uncomfortable. Besides, I'm not even sure you can afford something like this. This debt isn't just anything." Marisol didn't insist. She remained silent, though her eyes betrayed the frustration of not being able to act. She decided to change the subject, trying to lighten the atmosphere a bit. "And how long have you been here at this farm?" Alejandro breathed deeply, as if searching through his memory. "Since I was a child. My parents taught me everything I know about sewing and caring for animals. When they passed away, they left me the land with the hope that I would prosper, but each year has been harder than the previous one." The truck roared as it climbed the last hill. When they finally spotted the house, it was already getting dark. They parked next to the yard where chickens scurried beside a dusty tree. Alejandro turned off the engine and remained silent for a moment. He was exhausted, physically and mentally. Marisol got out without saying a word, feeling the tension in the air. As they approached the stable, they noticed something strange. The usual neighs of Lucero were not heard, nor the soft creaking of the wood. The silence was disconcerting. Alejandro frowned and approached cautiously. The stable door was ajar, something he never left that way. A shiver ran down his spine. He pushed the door slowly and saw the empty feeders. The space where Lucero always slept was unoccupied. A few disorderly hoof prints in the dirt indicated the horse had been forced to leave. "Lucero?" called Alejandro with a trembling voice, knowing deep down it was useless. There was no response. With his heart racing, he ran around the stable and checked the adjacent corrals. Nothing. Not a trace of his horse. Upon seeing Alejandro's decomposed face, Marisol immediately understood everything. Someone had entered during their absence. The night shadows lengthened and darkness became denser. Alejandro felt an abyss in his chest, as if they had torn away his last hope in one blow. Between the uncertainty of the debt and the anguish of not knowing who might have stolen the horse, the silence was unbearable. The night was deep, and the silhouettes of the corrals were barely distinguishable. Alejandro held the open stable door with labored breathing, contemplating the empty space where Lucero should have been. A lightning bolt of anguish pierced his chest. He felt as if he had lost a part of himself. Until that moment, he had thought his problems were limited to debt and water scarcity. Now, the theft of his most faithful horse added an unexpected blow to the list of calamities. Marisol, a few steps behind, put a hand to her mouth. Although she didn't know Lucero as well as Alejandro, she understood what the animal meant to him. She didn't even have to ask. Seeing the contained fury in his eyes, she understood that a desperate search was coming. "He can't be far," Alejandro murmured in a tense voice. "They must have taken him during the day while we were gone." He turned toward the house and called loudly for the two workers who still remained awake. Together, they illuminated the yard with flashlights and checked every corner. They found footprints leading to a side path where the somewhat softer ground marked the distinctive hoofprints of Lucero. Without wasting time, Alejandro ran to the garage to get some ropes and a more powerful lamp. Marisol followed him with a determined step, noticing the rage in each of his movements. "I'll help you," she said, taking an extra flashlight. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied, breathing heavily. "It could be dangerous." She nodded firmly, not even needing extensive words to show him she had no intention of staying on the sidelines. Alejandro, silently grateful for her gesture, included her in the small, improvised expedition that prepared to follow the tracks in complete darkness. They crossed the main gate and entered the dusty path. The flashlights made strange shadows leap across the ground as they advanced. The distant barking of a dog reminded them they weren't alone, but no one dared to interrupt the determination of that small group. During the journey, Marisol bent down several times to examine the shape of the hoofprints, as if she knew how to distinguish details that others missed. "There are horse tracks," she murmured, "but I also see tire marks from some trailer or old truck. I think they loaded Lucero and continued along the main road toward the highway." Alejandro was surprised that she could interpret those signs with such certainty. Something in her way of speaking and her knowledge of tracks contrasted with the city woman image he had of her. However, it wasn't the time for questions. The only goal was to find Lucero. They followed the tire marks to an unmarked intersection. The air became denser and a light mist began to filter through. Almost at the end of the path, a dilapidated barn rose next to a dry pasture. As they approached, an old man who lived in a nearby shack came out with a lamp. "Looking for something?" he asked in a hoarse voice, raising his chin to observe Alejandro. "My horse. It was stolen from my farm. Have you seen anything suspicious?" The man glanced sideways at Marisol and then pointed with his lamp toward the barn. "A few hours ago, a guy passed by pulling a horse that didn't seem to want to follow him. He didn't stay long. Then I saw him get into a dilapidated truck." Alejandro felt a new stab of anger. "Which way did he go?" "He took the highway south, probably in one of those abandoned lots. Although, frankly, that man gave me a bad feeling." With a quick thanks, the small group headed to the highway, fearing that the longer they took, the colder the trail would get. Marisol reviewed the details of the road, trying to locate any sign that they had turned onto another path. The search led them to an old corrugated metal construction. Between the dim moonlight and the flashlights, they managed to distinguish a horse silhouette behind an improvised fence. Alejandro's heart pounded fiercely as he recognized a familiar outline. "Lucero," he called in a low voice, hoping the horse would respond. A weak, almost muffled neigh emerged from the darkness. "He heard us," Marisol whispered, "but we must be careful." At that instant, a man emerged from the shadows, turning on his own flashlight with a dry click. He was tall, with an incipient beard and a defiant look. Behind him, a second subject moved silently, observing the scene with suspicion. "What the hell are you doing here?" the first one snapped with a threatening tone. Alejandro couldn't contain himself and stepped forward. "That horse is mine, and I've come for him." "Do you have proof?" the guy asked, as if he were a judge in his own realm. "Look at him, react to my voice," Alejandro said, raising his flashlight to illuminate the animal's face. Lucero stomped the ground with his hooves upon recognizing him. The thief let out a dry laugh. "I don't care if you want to take him. You'll have to pay. I bought him, or that's what I plan to tell the authorities. Besides, I've already invested time and gasoline to bring him here. Marisol approached with a lit gaze but without losing her calm. She noted the detail of a weapon hanging from the belt of one of the men, so she opted for negotiation. "How much do you want for him?" she asked in a neutral voice. Alejandro turned to her, shocked that she would be willing to put money on the table. However, he understood there weren't many alternatives. The man frowned, evaluating them. Upon seeing Marisol's clothes and way of speaking, he sensed he could take advantage. He gave a disproportionate number. Alejandro clenched his fists upon hearing the figure. He could never gather so much in that instant. But Marisol, without hesitation, took out a wad of bills from one of her pockets. No one knew she was carrying that cash, nor had she mentioned having it. She could have brought it in her travel bag, perhaps for unforeseen expenses or part of a personal reserve. There was no time for questioning. "It's not what you're asking, but it's enough for you not to cause problems. And believe me, you don't want more problems," Marisol said in a cold, firm tone. The man hesitated. A gleam of greed appeared in his eyes. He took the money. The seconds became eternal. Finally, he let out a snort as if giving in grudgingly. "Take your horse, but don't come back." Alejandro, barely containing his rage, approached Lucero. The horse was twisting in tension, frightened, with marks indicating recent mistreatment. Carefully, the farmer put the rope around his neck and drew him toward himself, trying to calm him with whispered words in his ear. He felt a wave of relief at having him back, mixed with the shame of seeing Marisol putting up money to rescue him. "I never thought it would come to this," he murmured without letting go of Lucero. "I'll accompany you back," she answered, directing an icy look at the thieves before turning around. Under the dim moonlight, the group moved away without looking back. They could feel the stares of those men stuck in their backs. The way back seemed long, but Alejandro didn't want to force the horse into any vehicle. Lucero needed a slow pace to calm down. As they walked, Marisol remained silent, reflecting on what had happened. She had spent money she didn't plan to use so soon, but it comforted her to know Lucero was safe. Upon reaching a clearing where there was a solitary mesquite, they stopped to let the horse drink a little water from the canteen they had brought. In that spot, with the starry night as a backdrop, Alejandro felt compelled to acknowledge Marisol's bravery. "I owe you a big one," he said in a hoarse voice. "I wish I could pay you back immediately." "You did the same for me when I had the accident," she replied. "It's not a matter of debts, but of humanity." He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. He had perceived too many signs indicating that Marisol was keeping secrets. However, understanding it didn't extinguish his gratitude. He wondered for a moment who this woman really was, who negotiated with such ease and wasn't afraid to talk to dangerous guys. They resumed the journey, already closer to the farm. Lucero seemed to recover his composure step by step. The morning began to insinuate itself, tinting the horizon with violet hues. At last, they spotted the first fences of the property. Alejandro prepared to face the same reality every day: debt, the constant threat of losing everything. But for now, at least, he had Lucero safe. They burst into the yard where the workers, upon seeing the horse's silhouette, approached with evident relief. Some patted Lucero and offered him water, but on Alejandro's face, tension reappeared as soon as he saw an official paper stuck to the main door. It was another legal document, different from the previous ones, with large letters and a notorious seal. He approached, read it in silence, and felt an icy knot in his stomach. Dawn fell over the farm with a dull glow, without a trace of rain, and with the air still charged with the tension of the previous night. Alejandro felt at his limit. Having recovered, Lucero gave him a faint relief, but the 48-hour ultimatum now hanging from the door made each minute count. The eviction notifications now hung from the door like a specter impossible to ignore. The sun rose in the sky, promising another scorching day. From early on, several workers approached with worried expressions. One asked if they had found enough water for the beasts, Another if there was any hope that the debt would be resolved soon. Alejandro had no answers. He felt the pressure grow with each step he took. With his head still foggy, he looked at Marisol exiting the house dressed in jeans and boots, as if preparing to work by his side. She too didn't seem to have rested well. "We need an immediate plan," she said, avoiding the topic of the previous night. "What do you have in mind?" "Honestly, almost nothing," Alejandro admitted in a thin voice. "But I heard about an agricultural fair in the neighboring town. Maybe we can sell something, even if it's just a bit of grain or old tools." Marisol's face showed some doubt. It was obvious that the fair wouldn't resolve such a large debt, but she preferred not to argue. She understood Alejandro's resistance to accepting direct help and realized that at that moment, what he needed most was a ray of hope, however minimal. They gathered what was left of corn and several boxes of crafts that Alejandro's mother had made long ago, hoping someone would be interested. They checked that Lucero was calm in the stable and departed under the relentless heat. The dirt road seemed endless. Each bump seemed to shake the doubts and uncertainty in their bodies, reminding them how precarious the situation was. Upon reaching the fair, the bustle enveloped them immediately. There were improvised corrals where livestock was negotiated, stalls with fruits, vegetables, and freshly made tortillas. A varied sound of laughter, haggling, and old truck engines came and went. Alejandro found a space to park the truck and arrange the merchandise in a way that would attract attention, though deep down he doubted he could sell enough. Marisol stayed a while observing the movement. She spoke with some people interested in the corn, while Alejandro offered the crafts in a friendly but anxious tone. They managed to sell some corn to an older man, and a married couple bought 2 of the wood-carved crafts. Adding those bills to the handful they already had didn't represent much compared to the figures demanded by the bank, but the small sale at least gave them a momentary respite. At some point, Marisol moved away, trying to find an area with better signal to make a call. She had been trying for days to contact someone who, according to her words, could offer her some help. She climbed a small hill behind the corrals where her phone barely showed one reception bar. There, with the sun hitting her directly, she made a brief call that sounded tense from the beginning. "I need that money now," she said in a low voice. "Yes, I understand. No, I can't wait any longer. There are legal issues at stake." She listened to the response with a furrowed brow, then hung up with a sigh of frustration. She lowered her gaze to the fair with its colorful stalls and the bustle of local people, longing to resolve everything at once, but also fearing to face Alejandro's reaction if he discovered the true extent of her resources. She returned to the truck, noticing that he looked disgruntled. It was clear that the sales barely covered the day's costs, much less the overwhelming debt. "Did you see anyone else interested?" Marisol asked, hiding the tremor in her voice. "Few, and what I've sold wouldn't even be enough for a month of interest," he cut off with a gesture of resignation. "This isn't going to save the farm." They fell silent. She didn't insist, knowing that at that instant, each was struggling with their own demons. To distract themselves, they walked among the stalls, trying a glass of fresh water and conversing with some artisans. Almost all faced similar problems: low prices, rising debts, increasingly scarce rainfall. A while later, a man who had bought corn from Alejandro approached them. He had an offer. He knew someone who would pay a bit more for a larger batch of grain if Alejandro could deliver it that same day. Although the amount was minimal compared to the debt, every penny counted. "I'd appreciate the opportunity," Alejandro said, trying to sound optimistic. "Where can we find this person?" "Over there at the back, next to the big corral. He's wearing a checkered shirt. You can't miss him." They headed to the indicated place. Marisol spoke little, focused on understanding the dynamics of the people. As they walked, she felt that Alejandro was becoming increasingly dejected, as if the weight of the farm was literally falling on his back. They found the supposed buyer, a robust man with a thick mustache who was inspecting livestock. They agreed on a slightly higher price than the market, which gave Alejandro a slight boost of hope. He sold practically all the corn he had brought. Still, when he added up the earnings, he knew that what he had obtained was merely symbolic. He needed much more to cover the debt that threatened to snatch away his land. But he swallowed his disappointment and saved the bills. "It's something," he murmured, almost to convince himself. "We can buy some bottled water for the animals, and that's it." "And nothing else?" Marisol asked with a hint of sadness. "Isn't there anyone else who wants to buy a tool? Most people are as bad off as I am. No one has money to spend on luxuries or on anything that isn't essential." At that moment, a rumble of engines was heard on the other side of the fair. Several trucks entered, raising dust. Among them, Marisol recognized the vehicle of the collector who had visited the farm days ago. A shiver ran through Alejandro. He felt his greatest fear materializing there amid the crowd, a cruel reminder that time was running out against him. They opted not to show their faces, collected what little they had left in the truck, and tried to leave with the least attention possible. When they were a few meters from the exit, Marisol glanced at the mirrors. One of the collector's men pointed in their direction, and in the reflection, the ironic smile of the boss of that group was visible, marking the rhythm of a sinister game. Alejandro pressed the accelerator, and they made their way through the people. The dust cloud they generated wasn't enough to hide the presence of those who held the fate of the farm in their hands. Marisol's heart beat fiercely, and Alejandro had an accelerated pulse. Nothing seemed more urgent than escaping those threatening looks. Suddenly, just as they were crossing the exit gate, the collector stood in front of them with a macabre smile, as if he had been waiting for them. At that moment, Alejandro understood there would be no way to escape his problems. The inevitable had presented itself in flesh and blood, ready to collect the pending account. As they drove back to the farm in tense silence, Marisol tried to appear inconspicuous in the passenger seat while Alejandro kept both hands gripped on the steering wheel of the old truck. In the distance, amidst the bustle of stalls and the roar of some engines, the collector could be distinguished with his threatening smile and gaze fixed on them, as if warning that the hours were reducing to a handful of minutes. Alejandro accelerated as soon as he could, leaving the dust behind and wishing to get out of that place before something worse happened. The return journey seemed long. Neither spoke, trapped in the discomfort of knowing themselves on the edge of the abyss. On the side, the light posts passed intermittently, and every time the truck fell into a pothole, Alejandro's heart seemed to shrink a little more. The night was descending quickly, painting the sky with a gray that threatened storm, though the region had been without rain for so long that it was almost a false hope. When they finally reached the farm, they breathed relieved to a certain point. They got out of the truck and looked at each other without saying a word. It seemed that the air had become denser. Marisol felt a knot in her stomach upon seeing once more the notification stuck to the main door. The reminder that by the next day everything could crumble remained there like a vulture lurking. A few steps away, one of the workers approached running with an urgent expression. "Boss, the well is almost dry. There's barely a trickle of muddy water coming out. The animals are starting to get restless." Alejandro exchanged a look with Marisol, feeling the world collapsing on him. Not only did he owe the bank, but he was also running out of water for the horses and the few cattle. Lucero, still somewhat stressed from his recent abduction, neighed from the stable as if sensing their presence. Alejandro went immediately to check the well without bothering to change his sweaty shirt or let go of the truck keys. The scene was desolate. Between the dust in suspension and the dim light of dusk, the mouth of the well was visible with barely a trickle of muddy water. Alejandro swallowed hard with disgust, attempting to fill a bucket, but not even reaching halfway before the pump released air. "Damn it!" he exclaimed, throwing the bucket to the ground in frustration. "How am I going to maintain the farm like this?" Marisol, who had followed him, approached cautiously, trying to offer comfort. "We could order a water truck at least to get through a few days," she suggested quietly. Alejandro's response was a dry grunt. He couldn't afford something like that. Besides, his pride was hurt that she would propose solutions he wasn't in a position to assume. Every fiber of his body burned with rage at feeling impotent. He abruptly walked away and headed toward the house without even looking at her. Marisol stayed a few seconds contemplating the well, feeling the tension and hopelessness accumulating. A couple of hours later, darkness had become total. The house remained in shadows to save energy, and only a small oil lamp in the kitchen dimly illuminated the room. Alejandro, with his head full of worries, barely tasted some reheated beans. Marisol didn't even sit at the table, leaving the food aside, too restless to eat. At that moment, a family friend arrived in his old pickup truck, bringing a few gallons of water. "It's not much, but I hope it helps," he said with a compassionate tone. Alejandro received him with a gesture of gratitude, though he avoided prolonging the conversation. The friend caught the thick atmosphere and left without insisting. After the vehicle disappeared in the dust of the road, Alejandro took a second to assimilate everything. He felt a slight tremor in his legs and had to lean on an old fence to avoid falling from the emotion. He brought his hand to his face, containing tears he didn't remember having shed in years. Marisol, by his side, looked at him with silent pride, aware that that farmer had defended his patrimony tooth and nail until the last instant. "Thanks for staying," he said, finally breaking the tension. "You didn't have to get so involved." "I don't want to see you lose what you love," she replied sincerely, stroking Lucero's mane, who had recovered some stability. That moment of closeness enveloped them both. They felt the emotional weight of their stories and the paradox of finding themselves on such different sides of life, united by the urgency of saving the farm. For an instant, the silence they shared under the roof of the stable was like a truce where there were no pressures or threats, only the scratching of Lucero's breathing and the soft tapping of his tail against the wall. It didn't last too long. Upon exiting, some workers who had heard rumors began to murmur that the lady with money would buy everything. One spoke of her surely firing them to bring in modern machinery. Another, more hopeful, commented that perhaps at last there would be water and sufficient food. The comments reached Alejandro's ears, generating a new dilemma. He was opening the door to powerful investors and didn't know if, in the long run, that would turn into a new type of slavery. Marisol, noticing his uncertainty, proposed a clearer agreement. "I see it as a partnership," she explained. "The money will come from my contacts, but the administration and direction will remain in your charge. You've already demonstrated that you know how to take care of the land. You've just lacked resources. And no, it's not about firing your people." Alejandro remained thoughtful. It wasn't the way he had dreamed of expanding his ranch, but perhaps it was the only way to maintain it. With a slight nod, he acknowledged that if the harvest flourished again and the workers remained, it could be a relief for everyone. The sun began to decline, and the night promised to arrive with a clear sky. It was then that, while reviewing more documents in the living room, Marisol's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and felt her entire body tense. She answered in a low voice and barely said a couple of words before hanging up. "It's my family," she explained in a thin voice. "They've just discovered my whereabouts. They say they could come at any moment." Alejandro remained silent for a long time, trying to assimilate that new revelation. "Your family? What family?" he finally asked, unsure about whether to fear or welcome that information. Marisol sighed, gathering courage to tell the truth. "I come from a family with great economic power. I am—" She made a brief pause, as if confessing an unspeakable secret. "I am the heiress of an international conglomerate. They dedicate themselves to investments, mergers, large projects in different countries." Alejandro for an instant went blank. The surprise was evident on his face. Instead of speaking, he brought his hand to the nape of his neck and began to pace. He had intuited that Marisol possessed resources, but never imagined the magnitude of that background. "And what are you doing here, in the middle of nowhere?" he asked at last in a hoarse voice. Marisol looked away. "They pressure me to fulfill certain commitments, something like an arranged marriage in business terms. I didn't want that, so I fled without notice. I simply mounted my motorcycle and went out to search for whatever, wherever, as long as I didn't feel caged." There was a heavy silence. Alejandro inhaled air through his nose, trying not to explode immediately. He felt used, but also understood that she was entrusting him with the truth at a moment of extreme crisis. "Why didn't you say it before?" he replied with a slight tremor in his voice. "I spent days trying to sell every grain, begging for loans, and you knew that you could—" "It's not that simple," she interrupted. "The money isn't individually mine. It belongs to the family. There are boards, documents, permits, a true legal labyrinth. That's why I couldn't simply write a check. And the truth is, I was also afraid of your reaction, your pride and the way you defend your land." Alejandro lowered his gaze toward the mud under his boots, trying to contain the wave of emotions. He assimilated the rage, the humiliation, and at the same time, a pang of relief at knowing that perhaps there was still some chance of rescue. "Then what do you propose now?" he asked harshly. "I have a way to intervene," she responded carefully. "I can stop that bank, at least temporarily, while I look for the appropriate mechanisms to inject money. I would do it through the legal structure of my family, but that would imply confronting them as well and perhaps exposing my whereabouts. I'm not sure of the consequences." Alejandro nodded, processing. He didn't know whether to feel more hurt or hopeful. Noticing his silence, Marisol took a deep breath, willing to be clear to the end. "I can help you save the farm, though we'll have to sign several papers. You would still be the formal owner, but there would be conditions. I need the endorsement of my lawyers and the approval of certain partners. It won't be something immediate or simple, but at least we would stop the eviction." The sun was setting. A few chickens scurried around the yard, pecking at puddles. The air had that morning freshness that didn't last long in the desert. Alejandro felt a pang in his chest. Would he cling to his pride and let the farm sink, or would he accept Marisol's help? "I believe you," he murmured at last. "It won't be easy for either you or me, but if you really can do it, I'll do whatever is necessary." "I do," she affirmed with bright eyes. "But before, I need to talk to my legal team. We'll have to make video calls, prepare letters, review clauses. I don't want them to deceive you or for us to make mistakes." Alejandro felt a strange warmth in his chest. Would it be anger, gratitude? It was difficult to decipher. However, it was clear that if time ran out, he would have to accept. He nodded once more, too overwhelmed to debate further. The tension didn't diminish during breakfast. They barely ate some eggs with tortillas amid long silences and nervous glances. Marisol took the initiative to explain some details to him: the family business, the investments they managed, the legal hooks that could arise. The atmosphere was charged with anxiety, as that possible way out implied a battle with an enemy larger than they imagined. "I don't promise you an instant solution," she emphasized, "but we can at least force a truce and then negotiate a real investment that saves the farm and leaves you in charge." Alejandro rested his elbows on the table with a furrowed brow. He was still in shock, but understood that, having reached that point, there weren't many alternatives. Outside the house, some workers remained expectant. They had realized something strange was happening with Marisol, and rumors were spreading in whispers. Upon finishing breakfast, Marisol headed to the living room, where she took out her laptop from a backpack. As soon as she turned it on, she realized the internet signal at the farm was almost non-existent. Alejandro remembered that on the nearby hill, sometimes something could be captured with a mobile modem. With the truck loaded with papers and an old generator, they climbed to the highest point of the property. There, with a gentle wind and the view of the cracked fields, Marisol managed to connect with difficulty. She scheduled a video call with two lawyers who handled the topic of family investments. When they appeared on screen, it was an overwhelming contrast: men in suits in large offices, and she in a dusty truck with a dry landscape in the background. "I need your help immediately," she said, feeling the latency of the connection. "It's an emergency acquisition, an agricultural project in northern Mexico." The lawyers exchanged glances. They were cordial, but their faces betrayed surprise at seeing Marisol's surroundings. "Miss, your family has been asking about you," one commented with a diplomatic tone. "They understood you were on a personal trip. but you never clarified that you were going to get involved in a business like this. We'll do whatever is necessary, she assured, adjusting the camera. Draft a preliminary debt purchase agreement and send it to my email. I'll take care of the signatures. The conversation remained tense. They talked about an investment fund, a trust for rural infrastructure projects, the possibility of stopping foreclosures using specific clauses. Alejandro, seated to one side, barely understood half the terms. He only knew that with each phrase, the fate of the farm was at stake. Meanwhile, in the back of the truck, two of Alejandro's trusted workers had approached out of curiosity. They managed to hear fragments of the conversation. One, surprised, wondered in a low voice if this meant the farm would no longer be Alejandro's. The other, more optimistic, said that perhaps at last someone would inject money to modernize it. Uncertainty spread rapidly. Marisol ended the video conference with a sigh, promising the lawyers she would stay attentive to her email, even if the signal was terrible. She turned to Alejandro, noticing his worried expression. "We're going to need your signature. Signatures and more signatures," she said with a grimace. "They've asked me for several property documents, in addition to the bank account statements. I have them at the house, though in total disorder," he replied with a slight shrug of his shoulders. They returned to the main building. The sun was beating down hard, accelerating the evaporation of the water that had fallen. The mud was drying, leaving cracks everywhere. Several farmhands looked with suspicion at the truck as it parked. However, Alejandro, without giving them further explanation, went into the house to rummage through an old chest full of legal papers. Marisol positioned herself by his side to carefully review everything. Amid the chaos of documents, he pulled out some humidity-stained property titles and the most recent foreclosure notifications. She skimmed each page, noting details in a notebook, aware that any error would be fatal. "Are you sure this will be enough?" he asked, breaking the silence. "It depends on the board of directors," she murmured. "They probably won't see it as profitable to invest in a place so damaged by drought and debts. But if I assure them it's part of my heritage, that I want to move it forward." "What would they gain?" Alejandro inquired with distrust. "Projection, image, long-term benefits. Perhaps even some reforestation plan or sustainable agricultural development. They have thousands of strategies they could apply, although you might only be interested in your crops and your livestock." Alejandro felt a pang of jealousy, as if his land were going to become a simple corporate experiment. "I'm not going to allow them to change everything my parents built," he warned. "I know," she assured, touching his arm cautiously. "I'll do my best to respect the essence of this farm." A sudden call pulled Alejandro from his anguish. It was the collector, informing that despite the rain and the agitated night, the bank was still not changing the deadline date. They gave him a scarce margin of days to pay an unreachable sum. Marisol saw his face transform into a gesture of profound resignation. "We have to hurry these papers," she whispered as soon as he hung up. "The clock doesn't stop." They tried to relax a bit and approached the stable to see Lucero. The horse seemed calmer, though sensitive to his owner's attention. In a corner, Alejandro offered him a bit of grass and stroked his neck, feeling that the animal, in a way, represented the stability he so feared losing. "Thank you for staying," he said, lowering his voice. "You didn't have to get so involved." "I don't want to see you lose what you love," she replied sincerely, stroking Lucero's mane. That moment of closeness enveloped them. The two felt the emotional weight of their stories and the paradox of finding themselves on such different sides of life, united by the urgency of saving the farm. For an instant, the silence they shared under the roof of the stable was like a truce, where there were no pressures or threats, only the scratching of Lucero's breathing and the soft tapping of his tail against the wall. It didn't last too long. Upon exiting, some workers who had heard rumors began to murmur that the lady with money would buy everything. One spoke of her surely firing them to bring in modern machinery. Another, more hopeful, commented that perhaps at last there would be water and sufficient food. The comments reached Alejandro's ears, generating a new dilemma. He was opening the door to powerful investors and didn't know if, in the long run, That would turn into a new type of slavery. Marisol, noticing his uncertainty, proposed a clearer agreement. "I see it as a partnership," she explained. "The money will come from my contacts, but the administration and direction will remain in your charge. You've already demonstrated that you know how to take care of the land. You've just lacked resources, and no, it's not about firing your people." Alejandro remained thoughtful. It wasn't the way he had dreamed of expanding his ranch, but perhaps it was the only way to maintain it. With a slight nod, he acknowledged that if the harvest flourished again and the workers remained, it could be a relief for everyone. The sun began to decline, and the night promised to arrive with a clear sky. It was then that, while reviewing more documents in the living room, Marisol's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and felt her entire body tense. She answered in a low voice and barely said a couple of words before hanging up. "It's my family," she explained in a thin voice. "They've just discovered my whereabouts. They say they could come at any moment." The sun had barely risen when two gleaming trucks advanced along the farm's dusty road, raising a cloud of dust that settled on the windows and the entrance gate. Alejandro, with his old shirt stained with dirt, approached to get a better view, sensing an unfriendly visit. Marisol, from the window, recognized the logo of the family company on the license plate of one of the vehicles and felt a knot in her throat. It hadn't been a simple threat. Her relatives were coming determined to confront her. From the first truck, two impeccably suited lawyers got out. Their manners were cold, almost mechanical. From the second, an uncle that Marisol knew well, a tall man with gray hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. He was accompanied by an elegant-looking woman with a portfolio under her arm, examining each corner of the property with disdain. A couple of assistants completed the picture, moving with hurried steps while murmuring among themselves. Marisol greeted her uncle with a dry voice upon seeing him exit the house. His eyes scanned the yard as if looking for a reason to reproach the place. What a reception. She swallowed, trying to appear serene. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon," she admitted, standing next to Alejandro to demonstrate she wasn't alone. Her uncle's gaze slid toward him, measuring his worn clothes, the dust-covered boots, and the serious expression of someone defending what's theirs. "I suppose you are the owner of this property," he said in a tone bordering on contempt. "That's right," Alejandro replied without shrinking. "My name is Alejandro, and this land has belonged to me all my life." The uncle didn't offer his hand or a gesture of courtesy. He simply inclined his head with minimal education and fixed his attention back on Marisol. "There are too many rumors, niece," he said. "You've requested an investment through our lawyers and personal accounts, and you've refused to attend the board meeting where your future in the family business would be decided. That behavior is putting your shares and your position at risk. What does all this mean?" She raised her chin. "It means I want to invest here. I want to save this farm from being seized, and in the process, demonstrate that I'm capable of making my own decisions." The words were followed by a tense silence. The uncle frowned more, and the woman accompanying him opened her mouth, indignant. "You alone? With what plan? The preliminary report indicates this ranch has enormous debts, drought problems, and deficient infrastructure." She paused to contemplate the surroundings with the shabby fences and thirsty animals. "It's not even remotely profitable." "It's not merely a financial matter," Marisol responded. "There's potential that you don't see, and even if it were a high-risk project, I'm willing to assume it." The uncle cast a reproachful look laden with reproof. "Marisol, you know very well that your movements affect the entire family. Your actions are governed by corporate statutes. If you persist in using funds for this seemingly worthless site, we could withdraw your participation. And worse yet, you could lose what corresponds to you from the inheritance." Alejandro, who until then had remained silent, felt rage bubbling up. He stepped forward, keeping his head high. "With all due respect, sir, my land is not a worthless site. I'm not selling my heritage. We just need an agreement that covers the debts and allows us to continue working. I don't want charity, nor do I aspire to be given anything. The lawyers exchanged glances. One of them pulled some papers from a folder and reviewed them quickly. The uncle snorted. A partnership? With what can you contribute with those dry lands? The irony oozed in his tone. Marisol, this is absurd. She crossed her arms. Absurd for you who only looks at numbers. I do care about the life that's here, the history of this land. I can convince the board that it's a long-term investment with social projection and potential for reforestation or rural tourism. Whatever it takes. I'm not going to yield. The woman holding the portfolio grumbled. You insist on making things difficult for us. If you refuse to return and sign the merger with the other company, you know what happens. They'll leave you out of the board table and you could be left without access to most of the capital. Marisol looked away for a second, struck by the pressure. Then she noticed Alejandro, who was clenching his fists. It was evident he didn't feel comfortable being treated as a mere obstacle or a negotiable piece. His farm was his life, not a corporate board. She understood this and took it as an impulse to remain firm. If that's what my independence costs, I prefer to renounce it, she declared. Her uncle opened his eyes in disbelief. I'm not a puppet of the company. I refuse a marriage that only serves to unite two fortunes. This is my decision, and the farm is part of it. A murmur was heard from the assistants. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, trying to establish order. Let's see if there's a way to accommodate things. Have you done a professional appraisal? Do you have profitability plans? He asked, looking skeptically at Alejandro. Will there be any clear return on the investment? Alejandro felt the need to defend his land, though he didn't have the verbal skills of people expert in business. These fields can produce if a good irrigation system is achieved. The corn or other grain harvest could be abundant. It's also possible to raise more cattle if water is secured. He paused for a moment, aware of his simple language. I need the opportunity and the capital to recover everything. The uncle, however, remained unmoved. He looked at his niece as if expecting a gesture of repentance. As he didn't get it, he played his strongest card. Very well, niece. Then you know that if we proceed, your shares, your vote in all future company decisions will be frozen. Are you willing to accept that? Marisol felt her heart tighten. The idea of losing everything wasn't insignificant. Her family, her economic stability, the network of contacts that had raised her. But at the same time, she remembered Alejandro's look when he spoke about the farm, the determination not to give up. She felt she could no longer turn back. She had found something that couldn't be bought with millions, the strength to believe in something real. Yes, she finally let out with a slight tremor in her voice. I'm ready to face it. The uncle clenched his fists and raised them as if wanting to contain an outburst. If that's what you want, I won't consent to it. Your parents would be ashamed to see you destroy the family business. My parents would never force me to marry for money, she responded, raising her tone, much less to trample on the dreams of someone who is willing to work hard. There was a moment when things seemed like they could overflow. The portfolio woman spoke vehemently about reputational risks and the lack of viability. One of the lawyers suggested they could involve the public administration to exert more pressure. Alejandro felt in the middle of a whirlwind, fearing that all those powerful people could crush him. At the climax of the discussion, a timid voice broke the tension. It was a younger cousin of Marisol who had barely gotten out of the car. No one had paid attention to him. He cleared his throat and raised his hand. Sorry, uncle, but I think we should listen to her, he said, turning red from the attention. Sometimes we forget that projects can have value beyond immediate profits. Perhaps we should give her a chance to prove her idea. The intervention of that cousin, so unexpected, fell like a bomb. Marisol looked at him gratefully. The uncle glared at him, but the boy stood firm. The lawyers moved uncomfortably, opening and closing folders. There was an evident breach in that family, and it wouldn't be resolved in a single day. After several minutes of arduous exchange, the uncle opted to take a step back. He said goodbye with a grunt, assuring that the matter hadn't ended, and that when the time came, he would move influences so the bank wouldn't accept agreements outside of those permitted. Before leaving, he didn't deprive himself of a last warning for Marisol. You're going to regret it. This isn't a game, and when you have nothing, you'll come begging to return to the company, and perhaps it will be too late then." "I assume that consequence," she responded, though with a lump in her throat. One by one, the visitors mounted their trucks and drove away, leaving the farm immersed in dust, the same image with which they had arrived. Alejandro remained on the porch with a tremor in his hands, confused and relieved that they hadn't forcibly installed themselves. Marisol, for her part, inhaled deeply, trying to calm the tachycardia that shook her. "You risk too much," he whispered, looking at her intensely. "You could lose everything. I don't care anymore. I'm not going to yield." Marisol fixed her eyes on Alejandro's with an expression of defiance and, at the same time, serenity. "This is worth it." They moved apart to take some fresh air and water. After a while, they went out to the yard where the shadow of a mesquite rose. There, without so many curious gazes, they spoke more calmly. Alejandro dared to confess that in some corner of his mind he had thought of surrendering, giving his farm to the bank, and seeking another path far from there. But upon seeing what Marisol was willing to risk, he felt a spark of hope reborn. The sunset came entwined in an orange sky that covered the fields. Some workers commented in low voices about the scene with Marisol's family, wondering if all that meant a better future, or if it would end in disaster. Alejandro and Marisol met again in the house, reviewing the pending documents. The tense calm had imposed itself, as if the two were waiting for the next blow. When light began to extinguish, the phone rang insistently. Alejandro, who was organizing papers, answered immediately. It was the bank calling with an almost formal tone, but charged with urgency. After a brief exchange, he hung up with a pale face. Marisol, restless, approached to ask. "They received a partial payment," he explained with a trembling voice. "They believe it comes from the account you opened in my name, but we need the rest of the money before tomorrow at noon, or there will be nothing to do." As night fell, they realized that if they didn't complete the payment by first thing in the morning, the farm would be foreclosed without remedy. The sun appeared timidly over the horizon, illuminating the cracks in the earth with a glow that seemed like a last breath of hope. From his room, Alejandro hadn't been able to conciliate sleep. He had spent the night reviewing again and again each document, each invoice, hoping to find an error that would allow him to save the farm without depending on anyone else. However, he knew that illusion was in vain. Reality was implacable, and without sufficient money by noon, the banks would execute the foreclosure. Marisol, seated at the kitchen table, anxiously reviewed her phone. The signal came and went, and every so often, messages arrived from the lawyers managing the financial operation. Each notification made her heartbeats accelerate. The definitive response to the farm's rescue could be hidden in one of those emails, in a final approval, in a document signed by her family's board. Without that green light, all the sacrifice would be for nothing. "The bank won't wait any longer," Alejandro murmured, entering with some wrinkled papers under his arm. "They gave me a deadline until today at noon. If they don't see the complete transfer reflected, this ends." She raised her gaze, biting her lip. Her eyes betrayed the attention of someone carrying too many promises. "I don't stop insisting to my contacts," she responded. "I'm still waiting for the confirmation of the main deposit. I know they already sent part of the money, but the most important is missing." He sighed, letting his shoulders drop. Outside in the yard, some workers who had been faithful to the farm gathered in small groups, keeping silent. It was noticeable in their gazes the mixture of nerves and hope. They all knew that day was decisive. On the fence nearby, Lucero moved restlessly, aware of the charged atmosphere. In the barren area, a neighbor appeared at the entrance carrying a sack of corn that he offered as a gesture of solidarity. Although it didn't resolve anything in terms of bank debts, Alejandro thanked him with a handshake, moved by the empathy of the townspeople who saw him as a tireless fighter of those dry lands. "I'll come back later to see if you need anything," said the neighbor with a gentle voice. "I hope things improve." Alejandro nodded without saying a word. As soon as the neighbor left, he felt the pressure on his chest again, The clock hung from a nail on the wall, and each advance of the minute hand was a small lash to the nerves of both. Marisol received a brief call from one of the trusted lawyers. Upon hanging up, her face paled for an instant and then relaxed. "We'll have one last video call in a few minutes," she announced with a broken voice. "They're defining everything, all or nothing." They climbed the nearby hill to better capture the internet signal. They carried the laptop, the modem, and a couple of portable batteries. Under a merciless sun, they installed everything in the shade of a mesquite and turned on the device. It took a few moments to get a connection, but finally, the screen showed the familiar faces of the legal team. Among them was a partner that Marisol knew well, one who had offered his support if she ever needed it. "The board has reviewed the proposal," the partner said with a serious face. "There are strong reservations about the project, but they've been moved by the personal relevance it has for you. However, they ask for an additional guarantee." Marisol's heart jumped. "What guarantee?" she asked. "That you commit to remaining an active member of the company, that you don't break legal ties. They say if you're going to dispose of family funds, you should at least stay in the structure to be accountable." She exhaled with some relief. She expected a worse condition, like the marriage of convenience or the forced merger. This, within the possible, sounded negotiable. "Agreed," she responded. "I can resume my place on the board as long as they don't force me to anything beyond the investment in this farm. I also demand that Alejandro retain control of his lands." "We accept those terms," the partner confirmed. "We'll proceed with the final transfer, but warn the bank it will take a few hours to reflect. Please confirm it to me." The news seemed that at last, there was a path to save the farm, though it implied that Marisol would remain tied to her family, that same one she had fled from. "It's not absolute freedom," she acknowledged as soon as she closed the laptop, "but it will prevent the bank from taking your lands." He held her gaze. "Are you sure it's worth it for you?" he said, with a tinge of tenderness and guilt. "I don't want you to sacrifice your independence." "I'm doing it because I want to," she answered with a hint of a smile. "And I can still negotiate my personal life. At least now they won't be able to impose a business marriage on me. If they try to force me, I can demonstrate that I'm capable of making this investment profitable." They dismantled the equipment and descended. The blue sky embraced the ranch in the distance. They saw a bank vehicle parked by the entrance. A suited man who wasn't the usual collector waited with a briefcase. They received him with caution. The man introduced himself as a representative of the branch, a level higher than the collector who had been bothering them for days. "We received a notice of partial transfer," he explained, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "But it's insufficient to cancel the debt in its entirety, and the deadline expires today." Marisol took the floor. "The rest of the money will arrive in hours. My lawyers are processing the operation. Here's the initial confirmation." She handed him some papers with digital seals. The representative examined them carefully, looking with attention at the logos of Marisol's family company. He clicked his tongue, aware that if it was real capital, the foreclosure play was suspended. However, he tried to remain firm. "Until we have the totality of the payment, the foreclosure order remains in effect." Alejandro felt his temples throb. He feared a new trick, a maneuver to pressure them or to demand something more. "How much time do you give us?" he inquired, containing his rage. The man looked at his watch, giving to understand that he had no intention of waiting too long. "Let's say that if the deposit isn't confirmed before the branch closes at noon, we'll have to proceed." A murmur of tension ran among those present. Many workers observed from a distance with the hope that they wouldn't forcibly remove their belongings. Marisol remained serene, holding the documents and praying that the transfer wouldn't be delayed. The minutes passed slowly. The heat increased, and the bankman remained uncomfortable under an improvised parasol, checking his phone and typing messages from time to time. Alejandro retired to the shade of a tree, incapable of looking at the clock, feeling his pulse in his temples with each second that ran. 20 minutes before noon, a beep sounded on Marisol's phone. With trembling hands, she checked the message from her lawyers. They confirmed that the transfer had been approved and that the funds were on their way. The exact amount covered the farm's debt and added extra for immediate expenses. A smile of pure joy drew on Marisol's face. She ran toward Alejandro and hugged him without thinking twice. "We did it," she whispered with a broken voice. Next, she handed the bank man the digital confirmation, the transaction reference, and the legal consent. The representative had no choice but to acknowledge it, checking his portable laptop to corroborate the entry of funds. With a resigned expression, he nodded. "Well, we'll consider the debt settled," he announced. "In the coming days, the release of the mortgage will be formalized. However, I remind you that any pending balance—" "There won't be any more pending balances," Alejandro interrupted with a gleam in his eyes that he hadn't shown for a long time. The bankman raised his eyebrows and said goodbye with a somewhat forced handshake. He got into his car and left, leaving behind a liberating air, as if the farm were breathing again. A murmur of relief propagated among the workers, which soon became exclamations of joy. Someone let out a, "The land was saved," and another shouted, "Thanks, boss," addressing both, without knowing that Marisol had contributed almost all the investment. After the vehicle was lost in the dust of the road, Alejandro took a second to assimilate everything. He felt a slight tremor in his legs and had to lean on an old fence to not fall from the emotion. He brought his hand to his face, containing tears he didn't remember having shed in years. Marisol by his side looked at him with silent pride, aware that that farmer had defended his patrimony tooth and nail until the last instant. That same afternoon, the clouds dissipated, and the sky acquired a golden tonality. The wind blew softly, carrying the aroma of wet earth that the last rain had left. In a symbolic act, Alejandro gathered the workers to announce that there would be no layoffs, and that they could resume their tasks with the security that the farm was still standing. There was still much to work on, minor debts to cover, and it was necessary to design a productive plan, but the threat of foreclosure had disappeared. Marisol remained in the background, receiving timid smiles and the occasional whispered thanks. She didn't seek recognition, only the confirmation that her risky decision had been worth it. When the twilight began to color the firmament, she approached Lucero and stroked his back. The horse no longer looked so nervous. He seemed to share the calm that enveloped the farm. Alejandro found her there, in the stable, in silence contemplating the horse. He stopped by her side, and for a moment he didn't know what to say to her. There were so many words that crowded in his mind, so many mixed emotions. In the end, the only thing he dared to do was place a hand on her shoulder. "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved these lands. I don't know how I'm going to repay you." She turned her head, and their gazes met. There was a profound warmth in her eyes, something that transcended numbers and family deals. "I'm not looking for you to repay me," she replied in a low voice. "We've come too far to understand that this isn't measured with money. In some way, you also saved me." They remained like that for a second that seemed eternal before heading together to the highest part of the farm, where the sky expanded in a majestic sunset. They mounted a small mound from where they could see the entire extension of the fields, now with a different future. The sun sinking on the horizon reflected in the pupils of both, sealing a silent pact of commitment and hope. She broke the silence with a whisper. "You gave me back something that all my money couldn't buy." Hope. A soft breeze passed between them as the last rays of sunlight painted the surroundings in gold. There was something new in the air, a feeling that went beyond gratitude or mere business partnership. Alejandro found himself looking at Marisol differently, seeing not the wealthy heiress or the mysterious stranger, but someone who had risked everything to stand beside him. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice carrying on the evening air. "Your family." "We'll adapt," she finished for him with a small smile. "I'm not running anymore. I've found something worth fighting for. Not just this land, but the principle that there are things money can't decide." Alejandro nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. They stood together as twilight deepened, the first stars beginning to appear above them. The vast field stretching before them no longer seemed a burden of debt and worry, but a canvas of possibility. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin again. There's so much to do." "Together," Marisol replied, the simple word carrying a weight of promise. In the distance, Lucero's neigh echoed across the property, as if the horse too was celebrating this new beginning. The threats that had hovered so oppressively had dispersed like morning mist, leaving behind a clarity of purpose that both of them could feel. As darkness settled completely over the farm, they walked back toward the house side by side, their shadows merging on the dirt path. The journey ahead would not be easy. There were still family tensions to navigate, a farm to rebuild, trust to strengthen among the workers, but for the first time in what seemed like forever, the path forward was illuminated by something stronger than fear. Hope had returned to the dry lands, carried on the winds of an unexpected friendship that had blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated when Marisol's motorcycle had first skidded on that dusty road. The weeks that followed brought gentle transformations to the farm. Like the first timid raindrops after a drought, changes appeared slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Workers moved with renewed energy, carrying materials, repairing fences, and clearing irrigation channels that hadn't seen water in months. The threat of foreclosure had lifted, leaving behind a cautious optimism that permeated every corner of the property. Alejandro spent his days dividing time between overseeing repairs and planning the next planting season. The injection of capital from Marisol's family company had been precisely managed, prioritizing urgent needs first: a new pump for the well, seed for the coming season, feed for Lucero and the other animals, before tackling larger improvements. He insisted on maintaining the farm's essential character, refusing elaborate modernizations that would change its spirit. Marisol, for her part, navigated the complex waters between her newfound purpose and her family obligations. True to her agreement, she attended remote board meetings, voted on company matters, and maintained her position in the family business. But she did so from the farm, making it clear to everyone that this was now her chosen home. On video calls, sometimes Alejandro would hear her firm voice emanating from the small office they had set up, defending the investment in the farm against skeptical executives with a passion that made him smile. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in strokes of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch, drinking coffee and watching Lucero graze peacefully in a field that now showed patches of green where before there had been only dust. "Your uncle called again?" Alejandro asked, noticing the slight tension around her eyes. Marisol nodded, setting her cup down. "He's still not happy, but he's adapting. The quarterly reports showing the progress here have at least silenced some of the criticism. It helps that my cousin, the one who spoke up that day, has become something of an ally in the boardroom." "And the marriage they wanted to arrange?" A smile crossed her face. "They've given up on that particular scheme. I think seeing me willing to lose everything rather than be forced into it made them realize it wasn't worth the fight. Besides, the other company found a different partnership opportunity, one that didn't require a reluctant bride." Alejandro laughed softly, the sound mingling with the evening breeze. In these quiet moments, he sometimes found himself marveling at how quickly his life had changed. Just months ago, he'd been on the verge of losing everything, sleeping fitfully with debt notices haunting his dreams. Now, he watched the land beginning to heal, felt the security of knowing the workers would be paid, and most remarkably, shared these evenings with someone who had risked her inheritance to save his home. "I keep thinking about that day when you crashed your motorcycle," he said, turning to look at her profile against the darkening sky. "If you had landed anywhere else, if your farm had been anywhere else," she countered, meeting his gaze. "If you hadn't offered help to a stranger." Their conversations often circled back to these what-ifs, these moments of chance that had brought them together. Neither could quite believe the sequence of events that had led them here, yet neither could imagine a different outcome now. On the far side of the property, the newly installed irrigation system hummed softly, bringing life-giving water to fields that had thirsted for too long. It had been one of the larger investments, carefully designed to conserve as much water as possible while covering the maximum area. Already the first sprouts of corn were pushing through the soil in neat rows, tender green against the dark earth. Don Miguel mentioned seeing clouds gathering in the west. Alejandro commented, said it reminded him of how the rain patterns used to be before the drought. "Do you think it might rain?" Marisol asked, her voice hopeful. Despite all the technological improvements they'd made, nothing could replace natural rainfall for the health of the land. "Maybe. The weather's been changing." He hesitated, then added, "Many things have been changing." The way he said it made Marisol turn to look at him more closely. In the waning light, his face appeared softer than in those first desperate days, the constant worry lines around his eyes having eased. Though he still worked from dawn until dusk, it was with purpose now rather than desperation. And increasingly, he found moments like this to pause, to reflect, to simply be present. "For the better?" she asked quietly. His hand found hers on the wooden bench between them, calloused fingers gently covering her smoother ones. "Beyond what I could have imagined." Their relationship had evolved in its own careful rhythm, like the gradual healing of the land around them. Neither had rushed to define what was growing between them, content to let it develop naturally amidst the daily work of rebuilding the farm. There had been moments, a lingering glance across the dinner table, hands touching while passing tools, a shared laugh over some small triumph, that spoke of deeper feelings than either had initially anticipated. "I received another proposal today," Marisol said after a comfortable silence had settled between them. "From the board." Alejandro felt a momentary tightness in his chest. "What kind of proposal?" "They want to expand the agricultural investment program. Use this farm as a model for others in the region. Sustainable farming, water conservation methods, fair employment practices, all the things we've been implementing here." Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by pride. "So they finally see the value in what we're doing." "Some of them do," she said with a small smile. "Enough of them at least. My cousin has been particularly vocal about the social impact potential." She turned to face him more fully. "What do you think?" "It would mean more resources, more support, but also more scrutiny, more visitors, more involvement from the corporate side." Alejandro considered this carefully. Once the thought of corporate executives tramping through his fields would have filled him with dread. But now, I think we could show them a better way. Not just of farming, but of respecting the land, the people who work it. He squeezed her hand gently. "We've already changed one company's thinking. Why not aim higher?" The smile that broke across Marisol's face was like the sunrise, gradual then brilliant. "That's what I hoped you'd say. I told them we'd consider it, but only if you maintained final authority over this property." "We," he corrected softly. "If we maintained authority." The word hung between them, significant in its simplicity. We. Not just a business partnership, not just an arrangement of convenience, but something deeper that had taken root alongside the new crops and repaired fences. As the last light faded from the sky, Lucero wandered closer to the porch, his coat gleaming in the silver moonlight that had begun to shine. The horse looked stronger now, well fed and cared for, the trauma of his near loss fading into memory. He nickered softly, approaching Alejandro with familiar affection. Rising from the bench, Alejandro stroked the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his hand. "He saved us, in a way," he said quietly. "If I hadn't needed to rescue him that night, if I hadn't helped pay the thieves," Marisol added, joining him to run her fingers through Lucero's mane, "we might never have truly seen each other." Their eyes met over the horse's back, understanding flowing between them. In the midst of crisis, with everything at stake, they had each revealed their true selves. Alejandro's unwavering commitment to his land and people, Marisol's courage to defy expectations and follow her conscience. What had begun as a desperate transaction had transformed into something neither could have foreseen. Lucero shifted between them, seeming to sense the moment's importance. His dark eyes reflected the stars now appearing overhead, ancient light reaching them across impossible distances, just as they had reached across their different worlds to find each other. "There's a local tradition," Alejandro said softly, his voice barely above a whisper in the gathering night. "When you save something together, a farm, a horse, a future, it binds you, creates a connection that can't be broken." Marisol stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing. "I think I felt that connection from the first day, though I didn't understand it then." His hand, still resting on Lucero's neck, moved to gently touch her cheek. "And now I understand everything," she murmured, leaning into his touch. When their lips met, it felt like the natural conclusion to a story that had been writing itself since the moment her motorcycle had skidded on his dusty road. Lucero nickered softly beside them, as if giving his approval to this final joining of their paths. In the distance, a rumble of thunder sounded, gentle, promising. The first drops of rain began to fall, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Neither Alejandro nor Marisol moved to seek shelter, letting the cool water wash over them as they embraced beneath the open sky. The rain, long absent, desperately needed, finally returning, fell on the crops beginning to grow, on the repaired buildings, on the workers' quarters where families slept more easily now. It fell on Lucero, who raised his head to the clouds as if in gratitude. Most of all, it fell on the two figures standing together in its midst. Their separate journeys now merged into one shared path forward. From desperation had come hope. From a chance encounter had come love. From nearly losing everything, they had gained what mattered most. And as the gentle rain continued to fall on the land that had brought them together, Alejandro and Marisol held each other close, sheltered not by walls or roofs, but by the promise they had built together. A promise as enduring as the earth beneath their feet, and as boundless as the star-filled sky above.